Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the CREMS webinar series. It's fantastic to have you with us here this morning, and you may have seen some of our upcoming webinars as you are waiting to view the session today, and I'd really encourage you to check those out and go and sign up for those on other interesting topics around comorbid mental health and substance use. And those are all available, as well as the recording for today's webinar and the handouts, which will be posted on comorbidity.edu.au training. So my name is Louise Birrell. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Centre of Research Excellence in Mental Health and Substance Use. And before I introduce our speaker today, for those of you who aren't familiar with the centre, I'll just give a quick overview of what the CRE in Mental Health and Substance Use, or CREMS, is and what we do. So at CREMS, we conduct research into improving our understanding of mental health and substance use disorders, and particularly why these problems tend to co-occur together within the same individuals. So we work to develop improved strategies and conducting research in how to more effectively treat and understand these problems. And so to achieve these aims, we work closely with services, schools, community providers and treatment service providers. And this webinar series is another way that we help to keep these lines of communication open and translate our research into the wider community. So it's great that you're all joining us here today. And we've also included a photo of our team here. The team is led by Professor Marie Thiessen, who you'll see in the pink down at the front there, as well as a range of researchers here working at the centre. So without any further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, who is Dr. Wendy Swift. Wendy is a senior lecturer at CREMS, and her current research focuses around the epidemiology and natural history and consequences of cannabis and alcohol use and dependence, cannabis potency, and the Australian cannabis market and substance use, particularly among older Australians as well. And we're really fortunate to have her with us today to talk through some recent trends in Australian data around cannabis use and attitudes towards cannabis legalisation. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to Wendy now, and we'll also have an opportunity to ask Wendy questions at the end of the webinar. So if you do have some questions as we're going through, please jot those down and we'll have a bit of a discussion towards the end. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Wendy.
Great, thanks very much, Louise, and good morning, everybody. As Louise said, I'm going to be talking today about Australian trends in cannabis use and legalisation over the since the beginning of the 21st century, and it will incorporate a bit of a summary of what we know, plus some very recent data that we've just analysed from the National Household Survey series. So this this research is a collaboration with my CREMS colleagues Tim Slade and Kath Chapman, Michael Livingston from La Trobe University in Victoria, and two colleagues from Columbia University in the USA, Ava Hamilton and Kerry Keys, who are experts in the sorts of analysis that I'm going to be talking about today. So just to start, I thought we'd start off with a couple of questions to see what you might think you know about recent trends in cannabis use and attitudes. So to start off, I thought I'd ask the question, recent Australian data show cannabis use has been increasing in the population amongst which groups? Is it A, the entire Australian population, B, younger Australians, or C, older Australians? So if you're happy to put in your answers, we'll see what you come up with. So you should have a poll appearing on your screen where you can click one of the answers.
So we've got some answers coming in, Wendy. I think most people have voted now, and I can say that we had 29% of people report that the entire population was the correct answer, but the vast majority have voted that they think it's amongst older Australians.
And they would be correct, actually. That's very knowledgeable of you all. Well done. I'll talk about that in a minute. One more question. Again, in recent surveys, in general, what do Australian population surveys show? Is it that Australians increasingly favour cannabis legalisation? Do they show that most people believe that cannabis should remain illegal, or most people have no opinion? Again, you'll see the poll on your screen.
So I think most people have voted now, and we've got 85% of people voting A, increasing favour of cannabis legalisation, with 15% of people voting B, believe cannabis should remain legal.
Okay, and A is correct, so I don't really need to give my talk now. I might go. No, that's correct. And again, we'll be talking about those issues in the talk. So that was just two quick little questions, and I shall start my talk in earnest now. The slide that's up now is just showing some of the data from the latest National Drug Strategy Household Survey, which is the population survey run every 3 years by the Australian Government on all drugs Australians use. And these are the 2016 data, which are not available to analyse yet, but they've put out the initial reports, looking at last year illicit drug use and trends since the 2001 survey. And you can see in the top right graph, the proportion of Australians who use methamphetamine has fallen, the proportion who use cocaine have risen, but cannabis still remains up the top there on that green line. There was a dip from 2001 to 2007, and there's been a sort of gradual increase again up to the current survey. If you look at the bottom left graph, the last year use by age, this goes to my first question. If you look at the marijuana or cannabis graphic in the top left corner, you can see that the bars represent years of the survey, with the top bar 2001, the bottom bars 2016. There's actually been an increase in use amongst older age groups, with the yellowish and white bars down the bottom and the 40 to 49-year-old age group becoming longer, whereas amongst the younger age groups 14 to 19, you can see that there's been a decrease largely in use as surveys have become more recent. So cannabis use did peak worldwide in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and then it declined, but it does appear to be on the increase again since then internationally. Australia has traditionally been one of the highest using nations, and cannabis has remained the most commonly used illicit drug in Australia. So as you can see, use is on the increase amongst older Australians. If you just have a quick look at this recent use graph, it just provides a bit more of an outline of that. This again, 2016 data. Along with methamphetamine, cannabis is the drug that's most used most frequently, that is at least weekly. So 36% of recent cannabis use is used weekly or more often, and that was the same with methamphetamine. But there have been some trends. So there's been an increase in the age of initiation. So people are starting it later. There's been an increase in the average age of users. So people are on average older when they're using these days. There's been a decrease in the number of younger users and an increase in the number of older users, especially males. And use among males aged 40 to 59 and people over 60 is now at its highest in 15 years, which raises the question, are we seeing the effects of increased use because of an ageing cohort? And again, these issues will come up again. Again, this raises the question, has cannabis gone off the Australian agenda? So as recently pointed out, cannabis is still the most commonly used and frequently used illicit drug in Australia, and along with methamphetamine. And in terms of treatment, cannabis is the drug for which people most commonly seek illicit drug treatment, along with methamphetamine. So approximately 23% of people who sought treatment were seeking treatment for cannabis or methamphetamine in 2015-2016. But there's been an increasing media and policy focus on other drugs, so it's gone off the agenda in Australia a bit. There's been concerns over issues such as ice, pharmaceutical opioids and novel psychoactive substances. There's been an increase in the popularity and media coverage of other drugs. And in the recent National Drug Strategy Household Surveys, people's perceptions of methamphetamine has changed considerably, such that people now consider it to be of more concern than any other drug, including alcohol. And a greater number have thought of it as the drug that's caused the most deaths in Australia. For the first time, methamphetamine was a drug most likely to be nominated as a drug problem. So there's been a bit of a shift in the way people perceive drug use. In terms of cannabis policy in Australia, cannabis has remained illegal in Australia for forever, really. Now, laws have varied in various states according to the jurisdiction. So we've had various states, for instance, South Australia, very early on introduced some form of decriminalisation and civil penalties. And depending which state you live in, there may be some form of diversion from the criminal justice system into the drug courts or into cautioning. There'll be discretion given to police as to how they deal with for minor offences. So there is some movement in that. But overall, in Australia, cannabis has always been illegal, and it currently is illegal. There has also been little attention to medical cannabis in Australia, despite some movement in New South Wales in about 2007. It never ever happened. So it's been some compassionate and prescribed access to cannabis, but it's been very difficult. There's been very, very, very little attention given to cannabis research on medical cannabis in Australia, and there's been a lot of barriers. I published the first potency results for Australian cannabis a few years ago, but it took me 10 years to get that study off the ground, largely because the laws in Australia made it virtually impossible to access cannabis for research purposes. So it's been very much a sort of static policy situation in Australia. But what has happened in 2016 is a new law was passed in Australia. So the Federal Parliament passed landmark legislation called the Narcotic Drugs Amendment Act, which became effective on the 30th of October and now allows the controlled cultivation of cannabis in Australia for medicinal and related scientific purposes via a national licensing scheme. So it has a detailed regulatory framework which enables applications for licenses and permits for the cultivation, production and manufacture of medicinal cannabis products. So that's an extremely new situation in Australia and something we watch with interest. In terms of Australian attitudes towards legal status, we touched on this at the beginning with the question. There have been a few surveys now that are showing that there does seem to be some sort of softening of attitudes toward legal status in Australia. So Roy Morgan have run a series of polls over the years of Australians, and they have found since 2004 that there has been an increase in those who believe cannabis should be legalised, particularly amongst the young and the old. The Australian National University have run a periodic election study where they look at a variety of issues around politics and social issues, and between 2007 and 2016 there was a sharp decrease in the proportion of their respondents who believed cannabis use should be a criminal offence. Marion Shanahan, who's a health economist here at NDARC, did, as part of her doctorate, looked at people's attitudes towards cannabis use policies, and they found when people were forced to make a discrete choice experiment where they were asked to make different choices about cannabis options for policy, they found there was a strong preference for civil penalties and a strong dislike of an increase in the criminalisation of cannabis. And it was linked to people's beliefs about the benefits that cannabis might be able to confer on people. These are the latest data on attitudes too from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. So there has been a marked increase in support for cannabis from 26% believing legalisation should be an option in 2013 to 35% in 2016. You can see down the left there's been a general increase in the more liberal policies for cannabis use. And people increasingly want civil penalties for cannabis use. Just a slide here. This is not the best slide in the world, and you cannot find a slide that agrees with any other slide. If you try and get a slide of cannabis policy internationally, every slide's different, and even the Australian one's not completely accurate. But what I just wanted to show you was that around the world there has been a lot of movement in cannabis policy, apart from in Australia, with, for instance, the United States. Obviously, each state in the United States have increasingly adopted medical marijuana programs. There's been a lot of movement there. Canada's about to legalise recreational use. There's been increased movement in South America and in various parts of Europe toward the legalisation of or decriminalisation of various aspects of cannabis use. There's been a massive increase in medical cannabis programs and the use of pharmaceutical cannabis around the world, and a lot of money invested in medical research looking at the medicinal effects of cannabis. And Australia's been largely excluded from that movement, and there's been a lot of policy stasis until quite recently, until last year's policy decision. There's been a bit of concern too expressed about what happens when policies are changed. So what is the relationship between policies, attitudes and use? So does an increase, for instance, in the number of American states who have medical cannabis mean that there's going to be an increase in just your recreational use? Or are people's attitudes going to change? Is it going to increase people's belief about how harmful it is? Is it going to result in an increase in use that we need to be concerned about? And basically there's been a lot of study, but the results have been very different, depending on, there have been lots of different methodologies and outcomes measured, and that there are mixed results on impacts on people's views of how harmful cannabis is and use. The policy think tank in the United States, RAND, did a review looking at the links between US medical cannabis laws and use, and they found it, in fact, there was a link between the introduction of medical cannabis laws in the United States and increased adult use, but not youth use. Catherine Keyes, who's collaborating with us on this study, found that despite overall decreases in perceived harmfulness, medical marijuana laws resulted in increased levels of perceived harmfulness in young. So what does that mean? Oh, okay. Despite overall decreases in perceived harmfulness across the whole population, medical marijuana, I can't even speak, MML resulted in increased levels of perceived harmfulness in young adolescents, who then decreased their use. There have been other studies that have looked at this and found that there are basically across the board decreasing perceptions of the dangers of cannabis. Among adolescent birth cohorts internationally, low disapproval has been linked to higher risk of adolescent use. And Bo Kilmer, who also works at RAND, has found that the increase in support for the legalisation of cannabis has been in lockstep with the support for same-sex marriage in the United States, and that there's been a general, what's called a period effect or a historic effect, showing that there's broad changes happening in the United States in regard to a whole lot of attitudes. So it's a very complicated situation with no single answer. When we're trying to sort of untangle these trends and understand what they all mean, we need to try and disentangle what might be going on, because these trends can be affected by a variety of issues. And the three main issues they can be affected by are people's age, so that is an effect that is present can differ over people's life course. So for instance, we typically understand that cannabis use peaks in young adulthood and decreases as people age, and that's the same with most drug use, that drug use does differ over the life course depending on what stage of your life you're in. Drug use can also differ according to an historical period. So there could be something happening in the period. For instance, a policy could be implemented. There could be massive periods of social change that mean that drives changes across the entire population, regardless of your age or what birth cohort you were born in. And the third trend, of course, can be because of cohort changes. That is, an effect can differ according to when you were born. So for instance, people born in a particular point of time have more in common with other people born at that time, and they can show changes that differ according to different birth cohorts. So one of the well-known ones is the baby boomer group, for instance, in which drug use really boomed in the late 1960s, because that's when a lot of illicit drug use was introduced into that cohort. So they tend to have different patterns according to different birth cohorts. Before I go on to looking at age period cohort analysis in more detail, I just wanted to also raise the question of a different trend, which is a gender gap trend, which we're tending to be seeing in rates of drug use, where people who were born in the early 20th century tend to be much more different if you're a male or a female than those who were born in the late 1900s. So that the initial gender gap, where we typically think that drug use rates are higher in men, has seemed to be on the decrease in more recent birth cohorts. Now, Tim Slade, Kath Chapman and I have written 2 papers now on these trends in both alcohol and cannabis use, using big combined samples from international studies that have looked at rates of alcohol and cannabis prevalence over time. Now, the data that I've got up here are from the alcohol paper, over 4 million people. And we found that if you look at the graph, that as you got a more recent birth cohort, basically the gender gap narrowed such that if you've got any alcohol use, problematic use of alcohol harms, the ratio of male use to female use really decreased down to about 1. Now, basically the cannabis paper, although we used a different sample and slightly different outcomes, we found much the same result, that there was a decrease in the male to female ratio of 2 in those born in 1941 to 1.3 in those born in 1995, suggesting that women and men's use of alcohol and cannabis has become more similar over time. Hang on. And these findings, my slide will not advance. Let me just see if this. These findings have seemed to resonate really strongly with the public. The There was a lot of media, particularly over the alcohol study. It was mentioned in English Parliament. And I think that's because they've reflected what many people have observed in their own research and anecdotally in schools, treatment settings, and within their own communities. So that's something to keep in mind. It was one of the questions we're interested in looking at in this study. Just in terms of, there's not a lot of literature on age period cohort analysis. Not many people have done these sorts of analysis. But when we have looked at the studies that have been done in the United States, there's been a general increase in cannabis use in the United States over the last several years. There's been 5 studies in the USA and 1 in Germany. 4 in America, and 1 in Germany over the years 1982 to 2015. Now, the 4 US studies have all been on the same cohort, and what they've done is each study has looked at them for an increasingly longer and longer period of time. And essentially they found that the trends driving the increase in use in the USA related purely to historical trends. So something has been happening across the American society rather than in an age or cohort sense that is driving increase in use. The German study wasn't really particularly relevant because they have found primarily that it was age that was driving studies, but it was driven by a lot of people trying cannabis and then a drop in that, a drop off, so they weren't maintained those trends. They found that there was little impact of the cannabis policy per se and queried whether it was actually changes in attitudes that were driving changes in use rather than policy per se. In terms of age period cohort analyses on legalisation attitudes, there have been 2 big studies in the United States that have specifically looked at this. And the first one, very similar time periods, the first one from the 70s to 2014 found a dramatic period effect here as well of increasing support for cannabis legalisation from the late 1990s. So again, a general historical effect across society, coupled with a smaller cohort effect. So there was also an effect of people born in the baby boomer cohort being more supportive of supporting legalisation for cannabis. In the second study, there was a similar period effect from the 1980s. So we're getting a lot of evidence that use and legalisation attitudes in the United States is driven very much by a general historical change. In the second study, perceived safety and attitudes to legalisation were moved in tandem. You can see in this graph here that as views on marijuana safety changed, so did views on whether or not cannabis legality should be changed from 1976 up to 2015. Okay, so which brings us to the study that we're doing. So Australia is an interesting case study because Australia's been at the forefront of drug policy and harm minimisation, etc. For decades now internationally. But in terms of cannabis use, we've really been in a stasis in terms of cannabis and potential policy change in medical cannabis, and this is in the context of substantial policy change internationally. So it's an interesting case study because we can look at changes in attitudes and use in a period where nothing has really changed in Australia. So the aim of what we're doing, these preliminary results, is to look at and compare trends from 2001 National Household Survey to 2013. Now the 2016 data will be added, but they've just come out. So we're looking at recent use, so last year use, and attitudes toward legalisation and criminalisation. Now the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is an ongoing series of population surveys of those aged 14 plus. It's conducted every 3 years, and they ask about all the major drug classes, policy, attitudes, treatment, your life circumstances, etc. Some of the questions change over time, which makes their sort of analyses difficult. We were originally going to do this this research on alcohol attitudes, but because the questions, not on alcohol attitudes, on binge drinking, but the data were just, there was so much missing data and such incomparable data across time, we just couldn't do it, whereas the cannabis data has remained fairly consistent. We were also interested, obviously, in seeing if we could look at what differences there might be in cannabis use and whether there was any sort of at least initial descriptive evidence of a decrease or a maintenance or an increase in a gender gap. So when you combine the ages 14 to 79 across these periods, 2001 to 13, we get about 120,000 people or so, about half of whom were female. We categorise them into different age and birth cohort ranges. consistent with the way these other studies have been done. So we've got 5 waves of data, and currently the analyses are descriptive, and we need to run further modelling to confirm these in a quantitative method. At the moment, they will be presented by gender, but we're also going to look at them by people's tobacco smoking status and education, because these 2 factors are well known to have an effect or be related at least to cannabis use. So when the 2016 National Household Survey data are released at the end of the year, we aim to incorporate these into our analyses. So remember, because we're presenting results by gender, we can't directly compare, but you can at least have a look at how they may or may not differ. So the 3 main questions we're looking at here, the 3 main outcomes are based on these questions. Have you used cannabis or marijuana in the last 12 months? So it's yes or no. And then 2 on attitudes. Do you think the possession of small quantities of marijuana or cannabis for personal use should be a criminal offence? That is, should offenders get a criminal record? And we have yes, no, and don't know. And then the last question is, to what extent would you support or oppose the personal use of marijuana cannabis being made legal? And there was a Likert scale, which ranged from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So we counted strongly agree and agree as evidence of support for the legalisation of personal use of cannabis. So I'm just going to go through the results with you now. I hope I'm not rushing through this too much, but I suppose it leaves time for discussion. Okay, this is just a first eyeball. This is not part of the age period cohort analysis, but just a little graph of basically males down the bottom, females at the top, by age, and we're looking at whether they've used cannabis in the last year or not. So for each graph we have the results from the 2001 down to the 2013 survey, with red being 2001 and purple down the bottom being 2013. And what there is evidence of is a decrease in use in more recent surveys, particularly in the younger group. So you can see at the beginning in the younger group there's much greater separation in use, with the more recent survey showing lower use amongst those age groups, that by the older age groups just isn't there. So let's see what happens when we actually do an age period cohort analysis. Now, it looks a bit messy, but I'll explain it to you. So on the left we have a graph showing the results for males, and on the right we have a graph showing the results for females. So we have 3 pieces of information on that graph. Down the bottom there's a legend that says there's age. So the left-hand graph is what happens from 14 to 79 in recent use for males and females as they age, and that's basically what proportion have used cannabis. In the middle and on the right we have a different scale. In the middle it's what birth cohort they were born in, so from 1917 or so up to 1998 or so. I can't remember exactly what it is, but the 1950 here is the reference group, so we're comparing things to that group, and that's done just basically on the numbers in groups. It's it doesn't necessarily mean anything in and of itself, but it's just a point for comparison. And on the right you have that little graph looking at periods, so from 2001 to 2015, and this is like a relative risk. So 1 is basically no difference, and if you've got a positive relative risk, your chance of using is increased, and if it's below 1, your chance of using is decreased. So I'll go through these. You can see initially though that there's a very similar pattern for males and females, and for both males and females all 3 effects were significant. So it was driven by cohort effects, period effects and age effects, but the strongest driver of effect in this group is the cohort effect. So that is, depending on which cohort you were born in, you had different levels of risk of recent use. And if you look at the middle graph with the 1950s, a reference group, essentially what it's saying is that there was a very low level of use from the early birth cohorts up to those born in the 1950s. Then recent use was highest amongst the baby boomer cohort up to those born in the mid-1960s, and then in recent cohorts use has decreased, which is consistent with some of those initial graphs we've seen from the National Household Survey, that it's basically the older groups born in the baby boomer cohort that are continuing on with recent use. The period effect shows there was a decrease for both males and females up to the year 2007, which is the reference group, and thereafter there has been an increase in use. As we've seen in the early graphs, there has been a bit of a rebound in cannabis use. If you just go back to the cohort effect, I just forgot to mention, if you look at where the males cross that horizontal line at 1, the men go back down to having sort of lower than average use in recent cohorts. But you can see that for the women, it's the dark line in the middle that you're looking at. The 2 lines around it are the confidence intervals. If you look at the women have not decreased. In more recent birth cohorts, the women have not decreased their use as much, which seems to be some evidence of gender gap closing there. And whilst the highest use was in the baby boomer birth cohorts, the decrease in recent use amongst more recent birth cohorts is not as significant among women as it is among men, which does seem to support the gender gap. In terms of age, which had the least effect, there was just a general increase in cannabis use up to mid-20s and then a decrease with age, as we've come to expect. If we look at support for cannabis legalisation, it's the same concept in terms of reading these graphs. There's age on the left, cohort in the middle, and period on the right. Again, we have similar, largely similar effects for men and women in whether or not people agree that cannabis should be legalised, but they're driven by very different things. So in the men, it seems to be driven by an historical trend. So for men seem to be more interested in supporting legalisation for unknown at this stage historical reasons. So there's been a decrease in those supporting cannabis legalisations from 2001 to 2007, but in recent years, that has increased, and so there's a greater support amongst men. And you can see on the right for women, period effect was the second biggest effect. There has been a similar trend but less pronounced. Women's support for legalisation has very much been driven by age. So they've basically started off pretty flat with about a quarter supporting legalisation when they're young, and it just decreases with age. So women tend to be more conservative here with men. You can see for men there's an increase in those who support cannabis legalisation with their age up to age 35, and then it decreases. But yeah, the cohort effect is stronger amongst men. Again, the baby boomer cohort, that middle cohort, where you can see the inverted U-shaped graph there, there seems to be, again, a stronger support for legalisation amongst the baby boomer cohort for both men and women, but it's stronger for men than in women. If we look at the other attitude that we examined, which was whether or not personal use or possession of cannabis should be criminalised, there is a trend again across time. You've got females at the top, males at the bottom, 14 to 18 on the left, with increasing age across the graph, and then the different colours representing the different years. There tends to have been a decrease in the proportion of people who believe cannabis should be criminalised in more recent surveys, particularly it seems with age. There's a greater separation of the lines within recent surveys. But what does the age period cohort analysis tell us about this? There was no period effect. So unlike the American research, which showed beliefs about criminalisation and legalisation were driven very much by general historical trends, in these data, while our legalisation data were driven by historical trends, there was no evidence of that when beliefs about possession being criminalised were looked at. So there's a bit of a difference here. It's quite consistent, though, with the data that Marion Shanahan, as I said, did when she did that forced choice experiment, where people were in favour of legalisation and also in favour of decriminalising offences. So what happened here is we get an age effect and a cohort effect for both males and females, but primarily an age effect. So with males and females, there tends to be an increase as people get to middle age, that increase in the belief that cannabis should be criminalised. But then as people age, particularly on the right there amongst women, the graph drops a lot more down. As women age, they tend to have a decreasing belief that cannabis should be criminalised. So they tend to become less conservative as they age in terms of the view of possession, which contrasts to their views on legalisation. So it's quite paradoxical for women. Again, with the cohort that tended to have the most liberal views on this, so the ones that had the lowest proportion of people who believed cannabis should be criminalised, was the baby boomer cohort. So not really any surprises there. It seems to be a very liberal cohort, if you like. One more thing we did look at was just the don't knows, because there were quite a lot of people who just really didn't know. And if you didn't know, you seem to be most strongly driven by an historical trend. And this is basically, if you didn't know, you sort of wavered all over the place. If you look at that period line, there was a sharp increase in the proportion from 2001 who just didn't know, up to 2007, that red line, which is the reference group. And then the number of don't knows decreased, and now it's on the increase again. So there's really a lot of uncertainty amongst people for both men and women. And again, that seems to be largely driven by historical effects there. So if you know what you think, you're not driven by what's going on generally in society, but if you don't know, you are. It's also driven very much by age. So as you get older, particularly among women, you're increasingly uncertain. And as your birth cohort gets more recent, you were born more recently, you're also increasingly uncertain. So there is a lot of uncertainty out there as well. So just to summarise, we found that there were similar trends for men and women in terms of recent use, and potentially there was a bit of a decrease in obviously in use in more recent cohorts, in the more recent birth cohorts, and an increase in use in more recent surveys. But there did seem to be some evidence for a gender gap. That is, women's decreases in the more recent surveys were less than the men's, which is consistent with what's being found in the general trend literature in cannabis when people have investigated this. So the recent use trends are dominated by cohort effect. So it's the baby boomers and the aging cohort that seem to be driving these recent trends in use. So increases in use in recent surveys are not driven by young people taking cannabis up. It's by baby boomers and older people continuing to use. We've also found that there are some period effects. So something's going on across society in a general sense that's driving use trends. In terms of attitudes, these very much seem to depend on the outcome we measured and the gender of the participant in the survey. So in terms of legalisation, there was a similarity in general trends for men and women, but it was driven by an historical period for men, so they found support increased over time, and it was driven by age for women, who tended to have lower support for legalisation with age. Possession, however, whether or not possession of cannabis use should be criminalised, was driven by age and birth cohort for both men and women, but there was no historical trend or period trend there. There was least support, that's a mistake. There was least support for criminalisation of possession amongst the baby boomers, who seemed to be the most liberal of all of the birth cohorts. And there was also least support amongst older women. As I said, it was paradoxical. As they aged, they had less support for legalisation, but as they aged, they also didn't want cannabis criminalised. And potentially, if people are unsure, they seem to be maybe more swayed by current policy debates, perhaps, that are going on. There are some interesting things going on, and we can have some discussion about what might be driving these changes. The first thing we need to look at, obviously, is what might be driving Australian trends in cannabis use. And at this stage, we've got no changes in policies or anything major that's happened in Australian society that could potentially be doing this. Unfortunately, we couldn't look at what people's views of the harms of cannabis were, because the question changed throughout the period that we were looking at the survey. So they unfortunately changed the way it was measured. So we can't look to see if changes in attitudes sort of went in lockstep with changes in people's belief about the perceived harms of cannabis. We do need longer term data to see how this plays out, particularly since the introduction of cannabis legislation enabling medical cannabis in Australia. So the first start, of course, is confirming our model, extending it to 2016, and then trying to find out what mechanisms might be driving these differences. But I'm going to end there now and I'll go back to Louise, who might open the forum up for discussion or questions.
Thank you, Wendy. That was absolutely brilliant, and so many fascinating questions, and I'm sure that will come out of that presentation. So for those of you following along, there should be a questions pane that you can see on your panel. And I'd really encourage you to type any questions that you might have for Dr. Swift so we can have a discussion at the end of the webinar today. But just to start us off, Wendy, I wanted to ask you about Australia's medical cannabis program and your thoughts on how this might have influenced community attitudes in some of the data that we've seen today.
Well, Australia's medical program's been non-existent, so it's probably had no impact in Australia. But what the things that might be driving these increased approvals, though, it's quite interesting in the United States. What they've found is there's been a general increase in support for more liberal policy that's been quite broad-based. So there's been more specific stuff like a decrease in the perceived harms associated with cannabis, but there's also been more general across the board social policy changes. So Bo Kilmer in the RAND review found that there's also been an increase that's kept pace with the cannabis increase in support for gay marriage. So there may be just general societal changes that are driving these things. In the United States, also with the introduction of the medical marijuana laws there in each state, there's been some findings that it's potentially people's attitudes that have driven these state policies toward medical cannabis, and then these policies have then gone on to drive attitudes. So it's quite complicated. And in fact, he goes so far as to say that the medical marijuana laws have in a sense been a Trojan horse for legalisation changes in the United States, that they've brought cannabis into a sort of level of acceptance that have made the whole concept of legalising cannabis much more acceptable, which in the United States, which has always had the war on drugs, you would sort of never have thought it would have happened, but it seems to have crept in there. Whereas in Australia, we haven't ever had a change in policy. We've never had a marijuana model for medical provision. So we don't know whether we're going to follow the United States in our attitudes because there's so many differences. They're finding in the United States too that these things are very much depend on whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. If you're a white Caucasian or a black American, so there's all sorts of different things in terms of your socio-demographic characteristics. It's quite interesting though that Michael Livingston, who we collaborated with on this paper, has just released a paper looking at the National Drug Strategy Household Survey attitudes on alcohol over the same time period. I just saw it a couple of days ago, and in fact what's happened with alcohol is quite the opposite to cannabis. There's been a massive increase in the concern across all ages from 2001 to 13 in alcohol. So he's wondering if that has now been because there's been a bit more negative feedback in the media about media coverage on alcohol, and there's been big increases in concern across all age groups, and that he's wondering if it's related to the decrease in youth consumption we're seeing in alcohol now, and that particularly if these negative attitudes have become more prevalent in young people's formative years when they're starting to take up alcohol, that it may have more of an influence on their use. So it's quite interesting to see what's happening there as opposed to what's happening with cannabis.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I know you mentioned that you would have loved to have done a similar analysis that you've done today with the binge drinking data, but it just didn't quite hold up.
Unfortunately, and they're not very good.
Yeah, that would have been fascinating to look at as well. And I think one of the other really interesting parts of your research is this closing gender gap between men and women in recent cohorts. And while I know this data didn't look into the mechanisms, you said that's potentially an area that you're hoping to look into in the future. But do you have any sense of what might be driving this closing gender gap, or what might be behind some of these trends that we're seeing with women catching up to men in terms of use?
There's been a bit of a discussion about what's driving it, whether it's a greater increase in use amongst women in recent cohorts, or just that women are decreasing their use less than the men, and there's evidence for both. And some of the findings or discussion points around this have been perhaps women are more responsive to policy change, that changes in policy around, because these gender gaps, literature reviews have been based on international literature, very few from Australia, mostly the United States and Europe, that there may be some relationship between policy change and changes in women's use, but mostly it's centred around the discussion that there have been changes in social norms. Women seem to have greater differences in their perceived risk. They may be more responsive to changes. And there's also been geographic and temporal change in the social roles and economic conditions of women throughout the 20th century. So perhaps of women have become more equal, if you like, to men in terms of their societal roles. Their drinking patterns and their cannabis use patterns have also become more similar to men's because there's maybe less stigma associated with use. There are less barriers, perhaps, to them using in a similar manner.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I was wondering if you could comment on some of the potential health implications of this data. I mean, is this suggesting that we would have different health messages targeted for different age groups or cohorts, or what kind
It's
of
it's quite interesting, because if it's I suppose the good news is that people are starting cannabis use later. Even though the increase is happening, it's not being driven by younger people, although where the difference lies is that it's being driven more, the decrease is less among women than men. So I suppose we need to, for women, to be aware that if they're not decreasing their use as much as men, particularly younger women, that perhaps they need to be a particular target of messages about cannabis-related harms. But in general, I think it's good news for younger people, because if they're delaying initiation till later and they're not using as much, then they're not setting themselves up for the risks that we know use in adolescence can really confer, because it's early regular use of cannabis in adolescence when the brain is plastic and, you know, people's social roles and transitional roles are all changing, that really can cause a lot of damage. So that is good news. There is evidence that people are starting to take things up later, potentially as people have been tending to delay the uptake of adult roles. There's been evidence from a variety of surveys that shows that people are staying adolescent for longer, that they're staying at home longer, and they're not transitioning to adult roles as early as they used to. The other thing is too that, though, well, it might be good news for younger people, for people who are continuing to smoke as they get into middle and older age, that's not necessarily a good thing, because they're exposing themselves now to a longer proportion of their lifespan where they're smoking cannabis, and we know that most people do smoke cannabis, and that it's the smoking that's the biggest risk in terms of route of administration, in terms of exposure to carcinogens. And there's not a lot of good long-term data where we've studied people long enough to see what happens when you follow people who started smoking. I suppose those results will be coming out, looking at the really longer-term impacts on cognitive function, on respiratory health, and various other things of people who do continue their use, which seems to be happening amongst this baby boomer cohort. So that is of concern. And there's one more thing, of course, is that with this change in legislation in terms of health implications, it does make the role of people doing research into the medical uses of cannabis easier. So I'm hoping to see Australia start to join the ranks of the world where it's doing some really interesting and valuable research what benefit either whole cannabis or pharmaceutical extracts of cannabis might have for various medical conditions.
Yeah, definitely. So it's a real opportunity for Australia to lead that research at the moment, which is great. And so what are the next steps for you with this period of piece of research?
It's pretty much finishing this off. At the moment, we're just trying to get permission now to use the 2016 data to add, and then we're going to try and confirm our models and just check that they do in fact hold up if we do the results a couple of different ways, and be more stringent about the sorts of things we look control for. But, you know, we say, okay, how does education affect this? How does smoking status affect this? And to try and just get a better fine-grained analysis of it, and then we'll write up a paper on it and disseminate the results out for that.
Yeah, fantastic. And just one last question before we go, unless other people have any questions to type in today. You mentioned that particularly the people who are undecided were people who may be more swayed by policy and debates in the media around legalisation issues. And I was wondering what kind of percentages you're talking about of people who did have undecided attitudes. Was that a big chunk of the sample, or were they relatively small numbers?
It wasn't, to be honest. Well, if you look at, if I go back to the graph, don't know, if you look on the left is percentage of people across different age groups. So it ranged, for instance, in the men, between 8 and almost 20% of men across the age span didn't know. and between 12 and 30% of women were uncertain, depending on
Right.
their age. So it's not a small percentage
Interesting.
of people.
Yeah.
So it's, a large minority. I don't know what you'd call that technically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's interesting, isn't it? So the younger people had quite well-defined attitudes with only smaller numbers
Yes,
of
but with
them
age,
seeming to
people are
know.
increasingly uncertain, or certainly the women are. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah, it's not
yeah.
necessarily what you might think intuitively,
No,
but yeah, really interesting
no.
to see.
Yeah, so there's a bit of, it's quite complicated stuff, and, it's hard to know what's having an impact in Australia because we haven't had any clear policy change.
Mm-mm. Yeah, but fascinating to see it broken down
Mm.
both by gender and also by different ages and cohorts to try and understand these trends in a bit more
Yeah,
detail.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Wendy. That was absolutely fascinating presentation today. I'd encourage any of you that have questions to please send them through and contact us today, as well as access our upcoming and past webinars, which are all recorded and available up on the CREMS website under training and webinars. So there you'll see the list of upcoming webinars, and we would love to hear your feedback both on the session today. So there'll be a short survey to complete where you can give us some feedback and also suggest any topics that you might like to see for future webinars. So I'd like to thank Dr. Swift for her time today, and thank you all for
Thank
joining
you.
us. Thank
Thank
you,
you very
Wendy.
much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.